Macron says Russia has already failed as Ukraine war enters its 5th year. French President Emmanuel Macron says Russia has already suffered a strategic defeat in Ukraine as the war moves into its 5th year with no sign of Moscow achieving its original aims. Macron described the invasion as a brutal attempt to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty that instead strengthened NATO, unified Europe, and exposed the limits of Russian power. He said Moscow had paid an enormous human and military price while failing to break Ukrainian resistance. The French leader stressed that Ukraine now stands at the front line of European security and that continued support for Kyiv remains essential not only for Ukraine's survival, but for the stability of the continent. He pointed to more than 170 billion euros in European assistance already mobilized, alongside new long-term financing and continued deliveries of weapons, air defense systems and military training. Europe, he said, will also maintain pressure on Russia's war economy and shadow oil fleet. Macron warned Moscow against assuming Western fatigue as the conflict grinds on into a prolonged war of attrition.
4 years ago, Europe awoke to the sound of Russian bombs falling on Ukraine. 4 years of a war of conquest chosen by Russia in brutal disregard for international law, sovereignty, and human life. 4 years of strikes on cities, destroyed schools and hospitals, and energy infrastructure methodically targeted to plunge families into cold and fear. Russia promised to seize Ukraine in a matter of days. Instead, it has taken only a fraction of territory, at the cost of enormous losses. More than 1 million soldiers killed or wounded. This war has become a military, economic, and strategic failure for Russia.
It's time for Russia to stop. That was the message from Czech Foreign Minister Petr Machinka, who told Russia Sergei Lavrov at the UN General Assembly that Moscow's plan for Ukraine has failed. Machinka stated that no major power can win against reality of time. He emphasized that while Russia may temporarily control territory and narratives through propaganda, it cannot control the course of history. Time, he argued, will always reveal who is destroying security and who is defending it. He stressed that the true measure of power is not in starting wars but in ending them, adding that Russia's strategy has become an endless campaign without realistic outcome. These remarks come as the Kremlin shows no sign of abandoning its maximalist war aims despite heavy losses and mounting international pressure. Applause on one side, visible anger on the other. Donald Trump's State of the Union has triggered a sharp clash in Washington over Russia and Ukraine as the war enters its 5th year. Republican leaders celebrated the speech as strong and victorious, but Democrats warned that the president is easing pressure on the Kremlin and failing to clearly name Russia as the aggressor. A signal, they say, weakens Ukraine and unsettles American allies. Trump devoted most of the record-long address to domestic success and economic claims, projecting confidence at home while offering little clarity on how his administration plans to confront Moscow's war. The reaction in Congress exposed a deeper fracture. The United States remains divided over how hard to push Russia under Trump, and Ukraine is increasingly caught inside that political struggle in Washington.
And I was very disappointed that President Trump did not take this opportunity to recognize that Russia is the aggressor in Ukraine, that our valued NATO allies have stepped forward and are investing in Ukraine's defense. He did make a reference to that. But bluntly, rather than rolling out the red carpet for Putin, as President Trump did when he welcomed him to Alaska, he should be increasing pressure.
Russia has given its clearest signal in recent days that it is not changing course in Ukraine. The Kremlin said that so-called military operation will continue until Moscow's objectives are achieved, with presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov reiterating that Russia has yet to reach its goals and sees no reason to halt the campaign. The statement reinforces a broader shift in Russian messaging now visible across official rhetoric. The war is increasingly framed not as a limited operation against Ukraine, but as a long confrontation with the West. Dictator Putin also met senior officials from Russia's top counterintelligence service, underscoring the regime's focus on internal control and security as the conflict drags on. Russian authorities say security measures around officials are being strengthened amid what they describe as growing threats linked to the war. At the diplomatic level, Russian officials continue to present negotiations as secondary to battlefield dynamics. Moscow maintains maximalist demands, including territorial conditions that Kyiv and its allies reject, while simultaneously signaling readiness for talks, a dual approach analysts interpret as an attempt to prolong the war while shifting blame onto Ukraine and the West. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has also reiterated Russia's narrative that misunderstandings with the United States have been removed, portraying Moscow as open to dialogue while accusing Western countries of prolonging the war. 4 years after launching the full-scale invasion, the Kremlin now openly signals that its strategy has moved from rapid victory to endurance, seeking to outlast Ukraine and erode Western resolve rather than achieve decisive battlefield breakthroughs. Europe is trying to engage China with a more unified voice, while also seeking leverage over Moscow to help bring an end to Russia's war against Ukraine. It is in this context that German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has arrived in Beijing on a visit that goes far beyond economics. Merz's trip follows recent visits by France Emmanuel Macron and Britain's Keir Starmer and comes ahead of a planned visit by Donald Trump. Berlin is signaling clearly that major global crises can no longer be addressed without Beijing, above all, Russia's war against Ukraine. Across Europe, frustration with China is growing. Beijing maintains close economic and diplomatic ties with Moscow and has not used its influence to pressure the Kremlin to end the war. While China describes its position as neutral, trade with Russia continues, softening the impact of Western sanctions. At the same time, Europe itself is becoming more economically exposed to China. A surge of Chinese exports is putting pressure on European industry, and the trade imbalance is widening. Germany now imports roughly twice as much from China as it exports there. Merz's mission is therefore twofold: to push for fairer economic conditions for European companies and to test whether China is willing to use its leverage over Moscow.
We are on the side of peace, and Ukraine wants to drag everyone into the war and seeks to establish pro-Ukrainian governments in places where governments do not submit to its war demands. And they are openly interfering in elections, like in our election. I think every sensible person in Hungary is aware of this.
These claims echo familiar Kremlin narratives portraying Ukraine as the aggressor and the European Union as a force pushing Hungary toward war. The messaging has become central to Orban's domestic political strategy ahead of elections, framing Kyiv and Brussels as external actors threatening Hungarian sovereignty and prosperity. Across Hungary, government-funded billboards depict Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky alongside European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen under the slogan, "Our message to Brussels, we won't pay." The campaign suggests Ukraine and the EU are conspiring to draw Hungary into the conflict and drain its resources. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has framed the war as an economic burden imposed by Brussels and Kyiv, warning voters that a pro-Ukrainian government in Budapest would send Hungarian money, weapons, and even soldiers into the war. The rhetoric has drawn sharp domestic backlash. Budapest Liberal mayor called the government's anti-Ukrainian messaging a shame and argued that Hungary's national interest lies in a strong, independent Ukraine capable of stopping Russian aggression.
The policy of the Hungarian government is a betrayal not only of Ukraine, but of Hungary's national interest. It is obvious that having a strong, independent Ukraine as our neighbor and stopping Putin's imperialism are clearly in Hungary's interest.
Ukraine's ambassador to Hungary, Fedor Shandor, said support for Kyiv is a shared global responsibility because Russia's war undermines international security and the principle of sovereignty. Hungary's stance has also intensified tensions inside the European Union. The bloc requires unanimity for sanctions and major financial packages, allowing Budapest to delay or block decisions about Ukraine. EU diplomats confirmed that Hungary again obstructed progress on new sanctions and financing for Ukraine tied to the war anniversary. Orban has increasingly portrayed the EU rather than Russia as Hungary's main geopolitical threat and accused Brussels of preparing Europe for war with Moscow. Despite the government campaign, public demonstrations in Budapest marking the invasion anniversary showed visible pro-Ukraine sentiment, with Hungarians and Ukraine refugees marching together and chanting, "Putin is a terrorist." That's all for now. For more content about Ukraine and the world, please subscribe.